The scanner beeped once. The woman at the reception desk looked at her screen. Then she looked at me. Then she looked at Daniel. That was the moment everything changed. Not dramatically. Not with music swelling or the kind of cinematic lighting people imagine for moments like this. Just a quiet breath from a hotel receptionist in a black blazer. A phone call she made without explaining why, and 8 words spoken into the receiver that turned the entire lobby's atmosphere sideways. Mr. Castillo? She's here. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I had no idea what was coming. Not even a suspicion. I was arriving at a corporate gala in Atlanta, thinking only about getting through the evening without embarrassing myself or spilling anything on the dress I had paid too much for. I thought I was just attending an event I'd earned the right to attend. I had no idea Daniel and Margot would be standing 6 feet away. But there they were. Of course they were. I noticed Margot first. She laughed that bright, practiced laugh she'd been refining since our 20s. The one she used whenever she was nervous and wanted everyone to believe she wasn't. She said something to Daniel about timing. About how typical this was. Daniel chuckled along, comfortable, at ease. The way Daniel always looked in hotel lobbies, because hotel lobbies were the natural habitat of people like him. For a split second, I felt that old familiar sting. 3 years, and a single laugh could still find the nerve. Then Warren Castillo walked through the ballroom doors. Not slowly. Not like a 64-year-old man with a bad left knee navigating a crowded lobby. Fast. Like a man who had been watching the entrance. He crossed the room in about 12 steps, extended both hands when he reached me, and said my name like it was something he'd genuinely been looking forward to. Catherine Marsh. He was smiling. We were starting to worry about you. Daniel's chuckle died somewhere behind me. I want you to sit with that moment for a second. Because if you have ever walked into a room where someone who once dismissed you is suddenly watching the world rearrange itself in your direction, not because you arranged it, not because you orchestrated anything, but simply because 3 years of invisible work had finally become visible, then you already know what that feels like in your chest. Like a correction. Not revenge. A correction. Warren guided me toward the main ballroom. He talked about the morning presentation. About Arthur Whitfield already seated at the table, about how pleased the board had been with the advisory work over the past 18 months. I listened and nodded and did not look back. Arthur was exactly where Warren said he'd be. Front left table, closest to the stage, back to the door. Reading a printed document like the rest of the room was irrelevant to him. At 74, Arthur Whitfield still radiated the specific energy of a man who considered wasted time a personal offense. I said hello. He looked up and said, "You're late." I pointed out that I had arrived 22 minutes before the event started. He said I should have arrived 40 minutes before the event started. The table laughed. I sat down. Something unclenched in my chest that I hadn't realized was still wound so tight. Seeing Daniel and Margot had opened something old and slow. Not grief, I had moved past grief. Something more like residue. The sediment of the person I used to be before 2 people I trusted completely dismantled my life. And I had to build a different one from the materials they left behind. I sipped sparkling water and tried not to let it show. Honestly, if you'd shown me this scene 3 years earlier, me, seated beside a board chairman and a legendary industrialist at a merger celebration in Atlanta, I would have assumed you had me confused with someone else. Because 3 years ago, I was not sitting at important tables. I was sitting alone at my kitchen counter in a house I was about to sell, trying to understand how everything had come apart so completely and so fast. I was 48 years old when it happened. I lived in a townhouse in Brookhaven, good neighborhood, solid bones, a small back garden I was quietly proud of, 11 years of mortgage payments. Marcus and I had been together 6 years, engaged for 1. I'm going to call him Daniel, because that's the name I trained myself to use after everything ended. Renaming him helped more than I expected. Daniel worked in logistics strategy. Ambitious, presentation, ready. The kind of man who could make a room feel organized simply by walking into it. I admired that quality for a long time. I supported it more than I should have, looking back. There were dozens of evenings when Daniel sat at our dining room table with cold coffee and an open laptop, working on presentations for executives who earned twice his salary, and I'd sit across from him with a red pen. I caught weak arguments, fixed transitions, rewrote sections that sounded like jargon halfway translated back to English and not quite finished the trip. I developed frameworks he was trying to apply. I explained the logic until it was something he could own in front of a room. He would lean across the table when I finished and say, "What would I do without you?" I used to love that question. I thought it was affection. Now I understand it was closer to a preview. Margot Ellison had been my closest friend since a summer retail job in our mid-20s, 23 years. We had survived layoffs and bad relationships and a flooded apartment, and her sister's addiction and my father's death. She had held my hand at the funeral. I had sat with her the night her marriage ended and watched her eat an entire box of cereal for dinner because she couldn't face a real meal. I believed I knew her completely. I came home on a Thursday in October because a client meeting was canceled. Cold, gray Atlanta day, one of those October afternoons that arrives dark and stays that way. I had stopped for Thai food. I remember holding a bag of lemongrass soup against my coat to warm my hands. I remember feeling happy. That's the detail I keep returning to. I was happy when I opened the door. I won't describe what I found in extended detail. You understand what I found. What I will tell you is that nobody spoke for a very long time, and that Margot was the first one to say something. She stood with her hands pressed together and said, quietly, "We didn't plan for you to find out this way." As if there was a better way. As if there was a version of this that wasn't going to leave me demolished. The weeks that followed felt like moving through water. Daniel took his things. Mutual friends began quietly choosing sides, not dramatically, not aggressively, just in the small ways that reveal everything. One woman I had known for 11 years told me that sometimes life rearranges itself and the healthy thing is to accept it. I stopped answering my phone for a while after that. The professional consequences followed the personal ones because grief doesn't contain itself to the area where it started. It spreads. My performance at work deteriorated. Nothing catastrophic, just enough errors, enough missed windows, enough mornings, when the version of me arriving at the office was clearly not the version they had hired. By the following spring, I had resigned my marketing director position. By summer, I had sold the townhouse. I moved into a rented house near Decatur and spent a significant portion of my days asking myself questions I wasn't ready to answer yet. Then one January morning, 18 months into the quiet of my smaller life, everything turned. I was working at a diner called Nora's. Corner booth, coffee going cold, laptop open, trying to concentrate on a consulting proposal I had been writing for 3 weeks. Someone stopped beside my table. I looked up and felt my brain genuinely stutter. Arthur Whitfield. I had met him through a professional association years earlier. Even then, he'd struck me as someone who believed most meetings were inefficient and didn't bother pretending otherwise. I had not expected to encounter him at a diner in Decatur on a Tuesday morning, reading a newspaper like it was a professional responsibility. We talked for nearly 2 hours. He asked the kind of questions that didn't feel like questions. At the end, he folded his hands and told me that a company he cared about was in trouble, and he needed someone who understood how to solve problems. I told him to hire someone younger. He said, "I want someone who's survived something." I told him I wasn't exactly operating at peak capacity. He said, "Good. Comfortable people patch problems. People who've been broken all the way down and built themselves back up fix them." I almost said no. Almost thanked him and went back to my rental house and continued the careful project of pretending I was fine. But something about the way he spoke, without pity, without flattery, without any attempt to make me feel better about anything, made me think he might actually mean what he was saying. I said yes. What followed was 3 years I can only describe as necessary. Not glamorous. Not the kind of work that photographs well. Whitfield Industrial was struggling when I arrived. Outdated systems, declining order volume, 3 larger competitors circling the perimeter. Most industry consultants I knew had already categorized it as an inevitable acquisition target. We didn't categorize it that way. We rebuilt the operational frameworks, modernized the client relationship infrastructure, overhauled the marketing architecture using models I had been developing across 12 years of professional experience, models that, in my previous life, I had used to help other people's companies succeed. Now they had a company of their own to prove themselves on. Arthur insisted on paying me partly in equity. I fought him on it. I wanted fees, predictability. He refused. "I want you thinking like an owner," he said. He was right. He was almost always right, and I refused to say that too warmly because he doesn't need the encouragement. 3 years later, Whitfield Industrial had attracted serious acquisition interest. The merger discussions concluded the previous summer. Warren Castillo's consortium led the partnership. The equity I had resisted accepting turned out to be the most consequential professional decision I had ever made. Not because it made me wealthy in some dramatic sense, but because it made me genuinely, structurally secure in a way I had never felt even in the Brookhaven years, when everything looked stable from the outside and nothing actually was. None of that was on my mind sitting at that table in the ballroom. What was on my mind was that Daniel had been watching me for 20 minutes. He wasn't approaching. He was standing near the bar on the far side of the room, holding a glass, looking at me the way someone looks at a math problem that keeps producing the wrong answer. Margot stood beside him. They whispered. He shook his head. She frowned. I will be honest with you. I found it funny. Not cruelly, just funny. Because 3 years ago, they had been absolutely certain they knew exactly who I was and exactly how my story ended. Now they didn't even know what I did for a living. Life has a sense of humor sometimes. A very dry, very patient sense of humor. A senior executive named Stephen Park stopped at our table that evening, shook my hand, told the table loudly that half the success stories being celebrated that night had started from frameworks I had recommended. I told him he was being too generous. He said he was absolutely not. Daniel watched the entire exchange from across the room. I noticed his expression shift. Not from confusion to understanding. From confusion to concern. Later in the evening near the end of the gala, in a quieter hallway near the conference wing, a woman named Priya Okafor found me. Priya had worked at my old firm years ago. One of the sharp junior strategists I had genuinely liked. She looked nervous, which was unusual. Priya was not a nervous person. She said, "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." I said, "Tell me." She said that Daniel had been presenting my strategic frameworks in executive settings for years. Specifically, she was precise about this, almost formal, a circular market alignment model I had developed at my previous company. Not once, not occasionally, repeatedly, in meetings with decision makers, taking explicit credit for the original design. I stood very still. That feeling wasn't rage. It wasn't triumph. It was something closer to pieces settling into the shape they had always been trying to form. The weight of it wasn't new. Only the clarity was new. Priya said she'd assumed I knew. I told her I hadn't. She looked uncomfortable. She said she was sorry. She said he referenced that model constantly in proposals, in board presentations like he had developed it in his own office, on his own time. I thanked her. I went back inside. I barely slept that night. I sat at the window of my hotel room and watched Atlanta's skyline and drank bad in-room coffee and ran backward through memory. Every presentation, Daniel had sat across from me while I explained the architecture of that model. Every late evening at our dining room table when he took notes while I drew diagrams on legal pads. Every time he had asked what he would do without me, he had found the answer. By sunrise, I had made a decision which was to make no decision at all. If the truth surfaced, it would surface on its own terms. I had spent too many years of my life managing outcomes that didn't belong to me. I was done with that particular habit. What I didn't know was that Warren Castillo had been doing some reading. The morning presentation started at 9. The conference center filled quickly. Nearly 200 attendees, board members, investors, regional directors, department heads, the kind of room where reputations are confirmed or quietly revised. Arthur was in the front row looking irritated that the session hadn't started 10 minutes earlier. Daniel arrived looking polished. Of course he did. Blue suit, clean tie, the specific confidence of a man who had inhabited rooms like this for years. He found my seat before the session began, came over, stood beside my chair. He said my name. I said his. He said he hadn't realized I was involved with the Castillo consortium. I said I was full of surprises. Something moved behind his eyes, a question he didn't quite ask. Then someone across the room called his name, and he went. His segment began an hour into the session. He was good. I want to say that clearly, because he was. He moved through his slides with ease, commanded pauses, delivered the kind of presentation that makes rooms nod and lean forward. He introduced a 6-category strategic framework, circular format, directional arrows, clear language, and presented it with the authority of a man who had worked with it for years. Because he just hadn't built it. My stomach dropped when the first slide appeared. I knew that framework. I had drawn the original on a legal pad on a Sunday afternoon 7 years ago, preparing for a client presentation I was terrified about. I had numbered the categories in pencil first. I remembered erasing category 4 because the language felt wrong and starting it over. I remembered making tea twice because I kept forgetting to drink it. I watched Daniel present it to a room of 200 people with complete, unshaken authority. I sat very still. He made his mistake about 4 minutes before the end. A board member in the second row asked, routine and polite, about the framework's origins, the kind of intellectual lineage question that signals genuine interest. Daniel answered without pausing. He said the model had been developed through years of his own independent research and executive experience. He said it clearly, definitionally, on the record. The room kept taking notes, but I noticed Warren Castillo, seated at the side, glanced toward Arthur, then toward me. The kind of glance that contains a decision. Warren was already standing when the applause faded. He said, "Thank you, Daniel. Before we continue, Catherine, would you come up?" The room turned. 200 people. Complete silence. I stood slowly. I was conscious of every step. Conscious of Daniel standing very still near the presenter's podium. Conscious of Margot, who had slipped in earlier, going motionless near the back of the room. I walked to the stage, and Warren shook my hand and turned to face the audience. He told them I had served as the primary strategic advisor to the merger process. He said many of the frameworks being discussed that morning had originated in my work years before the merger existed, years before Daniel Reeves had any connection to this consortium. He said he wanted to ensure proper attribution was on the record. Then the screen changed. Archived documents, dated presentation files, project records with timestamps, my name in the authorship lines, repeated across 7 years of documentation. Not theatrical, not dramatic. Just accurate. The room went quiet in the way. Rooms go quiet when something true is settling in, and everyone understands what it means. Then Priya stood up from the audience, without being asked. She said she had worked directly with me on several of these models and could confirm the documentation. A former client representative stood next. Then a regional director who had attended my presentations years before either of them. One by one. Quietly, factually. Daniel did not move. He stood near the edge of the stage while the room rearranged its understanding of everything he had presented for the past 40 minutes. I looked at him once, just once, and I saw something on his face that I hadn't expected. Not anger, not calculation. He looked like a man who had finally heard the answer to a question he had been afraid to ask for a very long time. The applause that followed wasn't the kind that celebrates someone's destruction. It was the kind that acknowledges a truth that should have been visible sooner. I found a quiet seating area near the river-facing windows around noon. Turboats moved slowly on the water below. The city looked clean and cold in December light. I was halfway through a cup of coffee when I heard footsteps. I did not need to look up. Daniel sat across from me. He looked like someone who had aged quietly in the span of a morning. He looked used up. Not dramatic, just diminished in the specific way that happens when the story someone has been telling themselves for years stops being available to them. He asked if we could talk. I said we were talking. Silence. Then he asked, eventually, if Warren Castillo was going to remove him from the project. And I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because I've thought about it often since. Not anger, not satisfaction, something closer to recognition, because that was still the first question. After everything, after the documents, after the names, after 200 people rearranging their understanding of his professional history, his first question was still about his position. Some things don't change in a morning. I told him I didn't know what Warren would decide. He said Warren wasn't returning his calls. I said nothing. Then he leaned forward slightly and asked if I might speak on his behalf. He used the word influence. He said I had earned it. He said maybe I could explain to people that it hadn't been intentional. I looked at him for a long moment. I said, Daniel, if no one had ever found out, would you have told anyone the truth yourself? His shoulders dropped. Just slightly. Just enough. The silence answered for both of us. I said, that's what I thought. He looked out toward the river, then back. And for the first time in 6 years together and 3 years apart, I saw something genuine on his face that wasn't managed or calculated. Shame. Not embarrassment. Shame. There is a difference, and I have thought about it enough to be certain. Embarrassment is about how others see you. Shame is about how you finally see yourself. He said, I'm sorry, Catherine. Just that. No conditions attached. No redirections. No version of, but you have to understand the pressure I was under. 4 words. Sincere. Late. Real. I sat with them for a moment. 3 years ago, those words were what I would have given almost anything to hear. Now they arrived after I had already healed in ways that didn't require them. And that taught me something I need you to hear, because it took me a long time to understand it. Closure is not a gift that other people give you. It is something you build in the space where they used to be. And when someone finally offers it to you years after you stop needing it, you realize you claimed it for yourself a long time ago without noticing. I said, I accept your apology. He blinked like he hadn't expected it. I said, but I'm not going to intervene. What happened today isn't something I created. You made choices over a long period of time. Now other people will make theirs. He nodded, slowly. No argument. He stood. He looked uncertain for a moment, like he didn't know what gesture fit the occasion. Then he said, I hope you're doing well, Catherine. I genuinely mean that. I said, I am. No performance in it. No caveat, no shadow. He left. I watched him disappear around the corner, and then I finished my coffee, and then I sat there for a while longer because I didn't feel any urgency to be anywhere else. The city was bright outside the windows. People moved along the riverfront below, unhurried. I felt, very quietly, free. In the months that followed, I heard updates through the professional network. Daniel's involvement with the consortium was discontinued, not immediately, not with fanfare, but steadily and without reversal. Trust in leadership circles is its own ecosystem, and once a fracture appears, it tends to spread further than the original break. Margot and Daniel's relationship dissolved within the year. Betrayal, it turns out, does not build stable foundations. Who could have predicted? Arthur called me one afternoon, 6 months later, while I was in the middle of a mentorship session with a young marketing analyst in Decatur. He said the merger numbers were strong. He said the board was pleased. He said I should probably start thinking about what came next. I told him I was already in the middle of it. He made a sound that meant he agreed. Here's what I want to leave you with. And I mean it as plainly as I know how to mean anything. For a long time, I thought this story was about Daniel and Margot, and what they did and what eventually came back around to find them. But it isn't. It really isn't. This story is about what gets built in the rubble. About how losing something false can, if you refuse to stop, create the exact conditions you need to build something true. You don't always get to choose when your life comes apart, but you do get to choose what you do with the space the unraveling creates. The mistake most people make in the aftermath of betrayal is measuring their recovery against the person who hurt them, tracking their failures, waiting for justice to arrive on a schedule. That tracking will hollow you out. It will take the years you needed for building and spend them on watching instead. What she understood, what I eventually understood, is that the most satisfying outcome isn't watching someone fall. It's realizing you stopped watching entirely, because you have somewhere better to be. If this story found you tonight, if something in it reminded you of a room you once walked out of and had to learn how to breathe again afterward, I want you to sit with one question before you go to sleep. What are you still measuring your life against that you could choose to set down? Drop a 1 in the comments if you think I made the right call walking away without intervening. Drop a 2 if you think Daniel deserved a harder response. I'll understand that position completely. Drop a 3 if you're somewhere in your own rebuilding right now, and this story reached you at the right moment, because those are honestly my favorite comments to read, and I read every single one. And if you're watching from somewhere outside Atlanta, tell me your city and what time it is where you are. This channel has reached people in places I never expected, and every time I see a location I don't recognize in the comments, it reminds me why I keep telling these stories. If something here was worth your time, the subscribe button is right there. It costs you nothing and it means more than I usually say out loud. I'll be back next week with another story I think you need to hear. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Atlanta, Georgia, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.